Well, Jackie, in part 2 of the review we're going to look at coverage here on the skirt, on the dress, on the sleeve, on the bodice and the capelet, the hat, and we're going to compare it with the coverage on the cat and the boots and look at a couple of ideas about how we can address that as an issue. Secondly, we're going to take a look at the cause and ways to get around this grinning or gaps here on the design. Now, over in Mbird we have the cat, and when we look at the parameters we can see you used fill number 1 at a density of 4, and in fact the coverage on the cat is great. Similarly, you used fill number 1 on the boots and it was at a density of number 4. Again, coverage was great. Now let's look at the sleeve. Again, fill number 1, but this time you used a density of 4.5. And if we go back to the picture, you can see here when we compare the coverage here on the sleeve on fill number 1 with the coverage on the boots, which are in similar directions although not quite the same, and also with the cat, whose stitch direction is actually going horizontally. You can see that this is much lighter than this. Now we'll take a very quick look at the densities on the skirt. Fill number 2, density 4.5. On the capelet, fill number 2, 4.5. The hat, you used fill number 6, I think. Yep, fill number 6 with density 4.5. All of these, it would be interesting to see, including on this bodice here, which was also in fill number 2, what would happen if you tried to put it at density number 4, whether in fact you'd get better coverage. Something else to have a think about also is that your underlay is quite wide apart. Now I know that throughout the whole of the design, because I've checked it, you've stayed with the double zigzag underlay at 4mm apart. That can be fine for an awful lot of projects, but what you've got to think about here is you were stitching a dark colour onto a light background, and sometimes if you can bring down the gap between the underlay and stop these long stitches, because some of them in this skirt certainly vary between 4mm long and 6mm long. It's just the nature of the pattern that has been used. But of course, when you've not got much of an underlay underneath it, then they move, and of course you're more likely to see the gaps. We can take a look at doing trial and error, but of course sometimes there's a quicker way, and whilst it's a little bit boring, it's actually worth having a look at this sometimes. So here is an example of some samples. I'm going to bring up my object properties in this program here, which is the equivalent of your parameters over in Mbird. Now all that's happened here is this is exactly the same pattern fill, but it's been stitched at different densities. The underlay that's underneath is a fairly standard one and only applies up to this point here. Hereafter I've taken the underlay off because I also use this as my reference samples for some light density digitizing work. So here on this one you can see here a spacing of 0.4. Every one of them's got a stitch length of 4, 4, 5, 5, 6, and you get the idea, it goes up. Now the purpose of doing this is it just means that I don't have to guess. Whenever I stitch out samples like this, I tend to do them either in a light thread on a dark fabric or a light thread on a dark fabric. Of course, you can use a light thread on a light fabric, and you probably won't, you'll get away with using a lighter density, but it's an advantage if you have the samples done already, stitched out. Just have a quick check, have a look at them, and make your choices about your parameters. The other thing, of course, that you can check is, say for example, select a particular density that you like using and then put different distances of the underlay underneath it and see what effect that has as well. So just quickly, whilst we're on samples, here are some others. Once you know the range, if you will, that you use more than any other, you can actually stitch out different patterns. Here we have just got 4 different densities, but 4 different patterns at each of those. You can do it with these deeper patterns. And then of course we can also look at stitch angles as well, how stitch angles can affect density, particularly in satin stitch. So as you can see here, satin stitch circles with different stitch angles. Some of them do seem to give better coverage than others, even though they're all exactly the same density. And then these 2 tennis ball shapes here are about overlaps and grinning, which is the next stage that we're going to look at. So back over in Embird, we're going to do a little bit of high magnification measuring, just to check a couple of things, like for example the distance of your overlaps of one trace line over another, to try and prevent some of this grinning issue. So first of all, I'll bring it up. Need to bring it up quite high, but already perhaps you can see some of the reasons why you might have some of the gapping. So let's pick up your tape measure here and see if we can measure this. This here is the trace line for the hair object, and this here is the trace line for the face object. Now, whilst your pull compensation, which is where this little zigzag sticks out beyond the trace line at 0.2 millimeters, those overlap, but unfortunately what happens, particularly when you have your stitch angles very, very similar, so for example your skin here is at this angle and your hair is at more or less the same angle, the pink when it goes down is yanking the threads underneath that way, and when this one comes down it's yanking them this way, and so of course that's how you get your pull compensation not covering it. However, what we do usually is we make sure that this is over here. Here they don't even overlap at all, and in fact you have a gap, and your gap is approximately, if it'll let me pick it up, it might not. Yep, there we go, 0.17 millimeters. Up here we do have an overlap, but it's very, very small. Here we go. So we have an overlap here, but then we have a gap again here. So let's see if it's possible to measure that overlap. I don't think it will be. Right, it might let us do it now, and we're way up high at 3000 magnification here. So this is where you actually have your hair overlapping your skin, and your overlap is 0.1 of a millimeter, so 1/10 of a millimeter. It's just not enough. And in fact, perhaps what you need to be looking at is aiming for an overlap of 0.5, half a millimeter, sometimes up to a whole millimeter. And what does that look like at a high magnification? Well, let's see if we can find one. Okay, here we go. On the eye, shadow, here. At this level of magnification, between that trace line and that trace line, which is your overlap, you have a distance of 0.46, so almost half a millimeter. Now I don't know at what level of magnification you digitize. I tend to digitize at a magnification of 500, and over a period of time you get your eye in and you begin to appreciate, when you're laying your nodes down, the distance from the previous trace line or across the previous trace line that you lay them down when you want to create an overlap. So let's say you digitize at something in the region of 400, which is what we've got showing here at the bottom of the screen. then your overlap of 0.5 millimetre looks like that. And that's the sort of overlap that you need to be looking for. And it explains why we've got gaps here, gaps between the trace line of the skin and the capelet, and there was quite a gap there when it's stitched out. Very little around here. Similarly again on the ear, no overlap. Anyway, not to labour the point, you just need to adjust that. It's a node laying exercise. Whether you would actually adjust it on this design, because I don't know whether you're going to use it again or not, obviously that's up to you. It's just a point to bear in mind for the future when you're digitising other designs. And just to go back to the exercises and to show you the difference here, this little exercise was a large ball and obviously divided into 2 colours. Both of them have exactly the same stitch angle, and I can show you that stitch angle is 15 on the blue and 15 on the green. It's the same on the red and green one. Now I'm going to take this up to a magnification of 500, which is where I digitise at. And on the red and green one, there is no overlap between the red and the green. And when this one stitches out, there's a gap that appears between the two. However, between the green and blue one, can you see this gap here? It's not really a gap actually, it's the overlap or the underlap. And I can pick my tape measure up here. That's one trace line, and that's the other, 0.85. And that's what the overlap looks like at 500 degrees magnification. And so Jackie, just to do an overall wrap up, this was a pathing challenge, and certainly in terms of mapping travel lines in between objects in order to connect them and avoid any trims, yep, you know what you're doing with that one. In terms of pathing and improving the efficiency overall of the design, have a think about cutting down the distance of some of the hops and ways in which you can do that, and also consider the flow through individual objects as they're filling up. Start and end points are the key to those. And the other 2 points that we covered is a possibility of doing some stitch samples for densities, boring but worthwhile, and finally have a little go and play with some node laying, get those overlaps cracked.